This is PD Volt. I am Syed Shabahat Ali, and you're watching Fault Lines. Pakistan and IMF team were in talks for over a week. The ninth review between Pakistan and IMF remained in conversation for quite long. This was arranged on a special request of Prime Minister of Pakistan. IMF's team visited and discussed a lot of stuff with Pakistan's economic management team, comprising of Ministry of Finance, State Bank, and all other relevant departments. According to the official statement issued by Secretary of Finance Hamid Sheikh on Thursday, International Monetary Fund has asked for more time for negotiations. In another statement, it was said that the eventual outcome of the talks will be announced after consultation with its headquarters in IMF by the IMF's visiting team. Now, these negotiations were extremely important because not only IMF demanded things that could have increased the difficulties for the government, but also took advantage of Pakistan's extremely fragile financial situation. This deal is going to unlock only $1.1 billion of transfer. But this $1.1 billion, which might not be a lot in itself, can unlock various other opportunities of taking credit from multilateral and bilateral donors. Why Pakistan's financial managers have been reluctant to accept the conditions extended by IMF's team, what have been these conditions that Pakistan have found difficult, and how this is going to affect Pakistan's macroeconomics at large. To talk about this, I have invited today Dr. Mehmood Khalid. He's an economist from Pakistan Institute of Development Economics and is joining me on Skype. Dr. Khalid, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Dr. Khalid, why these talks were stalled so far? Why we have not seen an all-out statement coming right away? What can be the reasons of uh, our reluctance in these negotiations?
Well, the IMF this time had certain preconditions before the release, the next tranche, which was supposedly going to add more miseries to the common persons, specifically from the inflation side, because they asked the government to increase the petroleum development levy, as well as they asked them to increase the GST rate on the normal, which was otherwise 17%. They proposed that it should be increased to 18%. So these, and on top of that, they also asked that the subsidies towards the consumers in terms of the tariffs for energy should also be taken away. So all those measures were going to add to the ongoing inflation bout which the Pakistan is having. So therefore, the government was a bit reluctant in terms of accepting their preconditions before the next tranche was built out.
Another important point that IMF team had taken up with Pakistan's Ministry of Finance was a concern on Pakistan's domestic revenue, which is not up to the mark as agreed with IMF during the last round of conversations. What can be the reason of decline in our domestic revenue, despite the fact that the government has applied some more taxes and has hiked the price of many things? The inflation apparently is on a record high level. Why still we have missed our revenue targets?
Well, actually, the two main reasons for the missing of the targets were the reduction in the import bill, because our major tax base is import. Almost 65% of our taxes are collected from the imports. So once the imports were stalled because there were restrictions on the import, and that led to reduction in the revenue from the import side. And besides, our economic growth projection was also reduced from around 5% to a new value of around 2%. So that too were the major factors. But on the other side, the FPR has its own structural problems as well, because historically speaking, we had been collecting around 15% to the GDP as total tax revenue, which has fallen down to close to 10%. So even if the macroeconomic condition is not good, on the other side, the revenue performance of the FPR was also criticized in the last, not just the last year, actually, for the last couple of years. So that is why the focus was that the FBR is actually not putting all its efforts in terms of collecting the resources, and they were criticized for it. But having said that, this year, the major reason for the revenue underperformance is because of these two reasons, where the import bills has actually reduced, and on the other side, the economic growth or the transactions has actually slowed down. But besides that, the FBR has its own problem. So that is why it was stressed upon the FBR to think about how they can additionally create around 600 to 800 billion worth of new tax resources.
Now, as you said, 65% of revenue is made of the imports. Now, do you believe that if these talks, supposedly, if IMF goes back and announces that they are good to provide the remaining tranche of 1.1 billion US dollar, will it kick off the imports that are stuck and stagnant for quite long?
No, in fact, as the IMF agreement with us is actually not going to bail us out in terms of the flow of resources, but what it is going to help us in is securing the lifeline support from the other multilateral institutions and the bilateral creditors like the UAE and the Saudi Arab government and certain other multilateral agencies have actually agreed upon providing certain resources, not just for the resource crunch we have on the balance of payment side, but also for the flood and other management requirements in terms of the infrastructure provisioning. So the IMF tranche is close to $1.1 billion, which is not enough for our requirements in terms of clearing up the backlog of imports, as well as going forth the repayments which we have to make in terms of the debt which needs to be retired. But this is going to help us actually create a credibility where we can now generate more resources for our lifeline support this year, where we are going to secure more loans from the multilateral institutions, as well as we are going to secure resources from our bilateral creditors. And that is going to gradually help us in terms of clearing up the backlog, which has actually stalled our economy in terms of the prospective growth which we were targeting.
And while we are talking about imports, Dr. Mehmood Khalid, the exports are also an area of concerns for the government. Uh, it's a major part of our national income, and because of a decline in imports, our exports are also equally affected. Do you believe it is going to change anything if IMF provides this transfer to the country?
Absolutely true. If you look at historically, our exports are actually close to $30 billion on a per annum basis, whereas our import bill has actually risen up to $70 billion per annum as well. So there was a trade gap of more than $30 billion on a per annum basis, which was earlier covered by the foreign remittances which were coming, which is close to $2 billion per month, and it has increased in couple of months up to $2.8 billion as well. So from that perspective, there was persistent deficit which is still running long, and that needs some other structural measures to be taken where we need to come out of this, because this temporary bailout or even the lifeline support which is to be provided by the bilateral countries is actually not the solution. The solution lies where the problem is actually, which is basically that we are buying more as compared to what we are selling to the rest of the country. And unless that gap reduces, we do something drastic in terms of how we can improve our exports, or we can think of somehow trimming our import bill. That is the only viable solution from where a trajectory of kind of a balanced on the external sector could be achieved. Otherwise, this is a temporary relief, and sooner or later, the same crisis may come out with more even force, where we again may have to go for another IMF program or have to think out of the box which is still not the solution.
Point well taken. Dr. Mehmood Khalid, but going forward, as an economist, what are you going to advise to the government in this situation to uh, bring industry back to its real life? Because without industry working, the government would not be in a position to collect more taxes and to meet the revenue targets as we discussed earlier.
Well, the major reform which the country needs, and fortunately, PIDE has done a lot of work on that side, is that we need to promote a kind of a trustworthiness in terms of the government's regulatory requirements and the taxation structure, which is going to help our own domestic industry to grow. What unfortunately is happening is that although we have improved, but still there are a number of regulatory regimes or requirements which creates a kind of a sludge in the overall businesses or extension in the businesses of our own businessmen and investors. I'll just give you a quick example. We have got a very big chemical sector which is actually exporting to a number of developing countries. But since we are not facilitating them in terms of the same types of treatments for investment credits and others as we are generously offering for the foreign direct investment, they are not able to develop their businesses up to that required scale where they can increase their exports. Similarly, on the taxation side, we have a tax structure in which the businesses are actually of a mindset where they think that if they grow out or they become more formalized, then their tax liabilities are going to increase. And the tax structure is more in terms of withholding nature, where the business transaction cost actually increases, so they would like to keep on the informal side. So we have to really focus on these two areas if we really want to improve the domestic commerce, which is going to help us grow to that level where we can also produce for ourselves and also we can export. But for the time being, in the given circumstances, there are no immediate reliefs in sight where such exercise is taking place.
Dr. Khalid, you spoke about the industries in this country that can take Pakistan out of this crisis. We are talking about facilitation of industries that primarily are a reason of national income. But what we have seen in the past is these industries that our economy has garnered thus far have been highly reliant on subsidies. Textile, be it sugar, be it protected automobile industry. None of these industries have been able to stand on their own legs without the consistent patronage from the state. Do you wish to see a continuation of similar policies for the other industries in this country?
Absolutely not. We are not suggesting that we should provide a subsidy regime which is without any conditionality attached to it. Like, for example, the most common conditionalities with such types of subsidies is that they have a sunset clause, they are not forever. Second is that it has to be linked with the performance. Very simple. If we can, let's say, target those industries which are kind of the underdogs and need some kind of an incentive where they can further improve in terms of what they're doing as a business and they can provide us the required exports. So it can be conditional in the sense that we provide them resources with a condition that if they can increase their export space. And there are examples, for example, the exports on our IT sector really needs a support in terms of setting up their payment facility centers as well as providing them some kind of a relief where they don't feel that they have to do these businesses informally or they have to think about some kind of an agency services where actually that agency is making rents rather than providing them the real return to them. So that kind of a facilitative environment has to be provided to our domestic producers as well. Because if you don't help them grow, or if you don't help them in terms of doing better businesses, they're not going to be very risk lover or they would not be going to increase their physical production up to that level which is required for engaging them into the international markets. We are absolutely not suggesting that we should make them addict of these sort of subsidies. Even looking at the current subsidy regime, we have proposed that it should be taken away. It should be done on a kind of a zero budget pacing where we really think, first of all, that what are we trying to achieve, and does that system of providing them some relief is attached with that performance requirement or not. And once that system is in place, then it should be made available to everybody who can take advantage of that facility, whereas they provide us the required foreign exchange reserves, or they are improving in terms of the productivity. Anything which is considered as a performance should be linked with that.
Dr. Mehmood Khalid, I found you quite concerned about the domestic business and its growth in Pakistan. Are you more focused on revival of domestic industry because apparently with this rate of exchange fluctuating so highly, foreign direct investment will remain to be an area of immense challenges for the economic managers of the country. Do you believe foreign direct investment might not be attracted under such circumstances, and this is why you are more focused on the domestic investments?
Well, actually, what I personally see is that for a economy like Pakistan, which has a large population base, as well as it's not a small country to be very realistic in terms of the requirements of the economy to sustain. So I'm not saying that we are lack in terms of any potentiality in terms of growing to that level where we can compete with the rest of the world. But the economies across the globe have actually improved, first of all, the domestic commerce to that level where anything which they provide or produce for themselves is equally good for export as well. Like, for example, take the textile sector. If we can produce the textile products which are on the higher side for some brands which are internationally doing their business, why can't we have our own brand which can also provide the same kind of production which goes up to that level where the international markets are also captured? But that needs some kind of an inward approach where our domestic commerce is actually providing them that base where they can go and then start competing with the rest of the economies. We cannot directly move into the export business without establishing a sound base in our own economy as well, in terms of improving the standards, in terms of improving our productivity, in terms of improving our skills, improving our capital, as well as the requirements for more efficient energy use and other things. So that kind of a framework is actually going to help us to sustain the production for domestic use as well as the exports as well. Without that industrialization, we cannot simply move towards the export base without having substantial production for our own economy as well.
Well, another important area of concern for IMF was the debt servicing. Now, as a matter of fact, this has also increased remarkably. Pakistan's debt servicing obligations in this year have hugely and immensely increased because of the revised exchange rate that we have observed so far. Is it another area of concern for IMF?
Well, actually, what the IMF does is that considering the debt servicing requirements are kind of linked with factors which are not controlled by the government directive among themselves. For example, on the one side, the requirement to do monetary policy restriction is going to increase the funding cost from the banking sector. They know, and on the other side, if we have a free float of the exchange rate, that's also going to put pressure in terms of our debt servicing capacity. So what they do is that they, instead of targeting the overall budget deficit, what they think is that they should target on the primary deficit, which is basically taking away the interest payments from it. So the targets are set in terms of the primary deficits to be zero or positive to be on the safer side, but that interest payments are actually excluded from that. So that is a kind of a relief which generally the governments are provided with. But for us, from the development side or the development perspective, we are really hit with it because when we are trying to manage the overall primary deficit as well, because the money is fungible. If you are not spending in one entity, that is going to be provided for the other entity. So, in order to have the primary budget surplus, now the government actually has to make certain maneuvers in the commitments which it made at the time of budget presenting, such as having a close to 1 trillion rupees worth of the public sector development program that has been curtailed. On the other side, the provinces has also been asked to generate surplus, which actually is cutting down in terms of their development expenditures or the other expenditures which the provincial governments were doing. So that all mixed is going to put pressure in terms of how the government is trying to achieve certain requirements which the IMF has asked as a conditionality. But doing so, the IMF does not go into very typical heads of expenditures. At least earlier, that was their practice, that they used to target only on the macro pictures where they are going to put you in terms of a conditionality framework where you are targeting the primary budget deficit or the surplus. And on the other side, they're going to ask you to protect the vulnerable by providing them relief, and that is an amount which the IMF agrees with the government. But this year long, I'm not sure that when the details come out that had they kept the same kind of framework or they have further talked about reducing certain number of expenditures uh, because these are again the newspaper items such as disclosing the public assets of the civil servants and others. So that sort of requirement has to be seen yet that how they are now trying to manage in terms of the budgetary affairs of the governments as well.
Dr. Mahmood, you said IMF does not wish to get into the micromanagement of things, but let me point out an example where privatization of specific projects have been identified as an agenda point by IMF, specific power projects. Now, without getting into details of what might be wrong with these specific power projects, why Team IMF would be interested to micromanage the privatization in this country?
Well, yes, this time they are also, as I said, that they're trying to micromanage the things as well because these are very apparent things. So if you talk about the public sector entities, they have created debt, quasi debt, which actually the governments have to then repay. Like, for example, the PIA, the railway, the Pakistan Steel, and other public sector enterprises. Actually, they are mounting up huge deficits, which are again funded by the banks. And that is actually the liability of the government on the other side. So that is putting pressure in terms of providing sound money for the private sector actually to do their businesses. So that is why the IMF this time is also proposing that certain entities which are actually bleeding or not contributing to the economy as such, they should be privatized or they should be handed over to managements which can run them in a better way as compared to the current structures. So what they're trying to do is that they're trying to propose us some measures which are politically very tough, but since it can come as a conditionality, so that can be taken above as a possible option. And this is not just the public sector enterprises, as one of their requirement is that the energy tariffs should also be rationalized and the subsidy should be taken away because the circular debt for the energy, both for the electricity as well as for the gas, has actually risen so high that it is taking away all the resources from the banking sector as loans or credits, which could otherwise be provided for the private sector to do business. So that kind of a conditionality framework, which politically is very difficult to achieve, is coming through as a conditionality because they think that if government can take refuge by saying that this is a kind of an IMF conditionality which you have to meet, maybe this can be proposed further. And we agree with that because that is something which the governments have to decide for. They have to think about certain critical reforms, which either can be in terms of doing the management better or the governance side, or they have to basically simply stop doing that business which governments are unable to do in a better manner.
Dr. Mehmood Khalid, one of other areas of concern for IMF was the free floating exchange rate. They wanted um, the government to get out of the idea of having a different exchange rate for banking and different exchange rate in market. This has been accomplished, and now it has been observed that we have almost a similar rate of exchange in the market. Do you believe it has improved, or will it improve the remittances that Pakistan was getting, which might be very critical given our extremely low level of reserves at the moment?
Well, actually, the currency trading has improved because of these positive signs which have emerged in terms of having go ahead with the IMF. The interbank rate and the open market rate has actually receded. The open market rate has come down by about 5 rupees, and it is trading around 273 rupees per dollar, whereas the interbank rate has gone down up to 270. So that is a positive sign for the foreign exchange markets, and they're taking it as a positive sign. But the opening up earlier was a requirement because we did not have that much cover with the state bank, which could intervene and try to stabilize the dollar. The foreign exchange is actually a market, and that market determines its rate. Now, if we try to intervene in it, for that we need to have a large base of reserves with us, which we can use in terms of stabilizing it, which the government actually didn't have. So just keeping it on kind of a book value, whereas the actual market is leading towards a black market premium, was a bad idea from the very first day. So that is something which was there in the system. And once it was allowed to free float, the dollar value actually adjusted. And as the good news started to come in, the dollar value has actually started to improve in terms of the PKR. And hopefully, as the things improve more, as the system gets more foreign exchange as injection, and hopefully, if our productivity and other initiatives help us in terms of improving our trade balances, so that dollar is further going to improve. And I think that that was a move which was due, whether it was coming through an IMF conditionality or had it been our own reform, we were expecting this to happen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmood Khalid, for being guest in our program
Pleasure,
today.
pleasure, pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with second segment of program. Stay with us. Welcome back. On Monday, an earthquake has hit the southern part of Turkey and northern part of Syria. This is one of the worst earthquakes that have ever hit a country, particularly in context of the Turkish history. Turkey, unfortunately, is situated in a geographical location that lies on some fault lines, and has been observing such or has been observing earthquakes quite frequently. One was recorded in late 90s, but these earthquakes that have hit Turkey back to back on Monday have brought miseries that are unmatchable in or cannot be compared with any such thing in the past. To quote you the figures, there are 22,000 people reported dead so far, out of which almost 19,000 are reported dead in Turkey alone. But this does not mean that the catastrophe is less in Syria, because inside Syria there are few opportunities for media to go and to get the reports through the Turkish government as well. Now, the magnitude as calculated was 7.8, which was ever highest. And on the same day, there was then some other aftershocks that have hit the country. The catastrophe is so big in its magnitude that there is a shortage of space in the Turkish graveyards. And there are bodies lying in queue, waiting for the funeral. The president of Turkey has declared an emergency, a national emergency has been declared, and the government of Turkey is trying to grapple with the crisis that have unfolded, unfortunately, due to this event. To talk about it, we have invited in our program Professor Dr. Yugel Ajer. He's expert of Turkish affairs, joining me from Ankara, where he is a professor in Ankara, Yildirim Basit University. Professor Dr. Yugel Ajer, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Professor Ajer, how badly is Turkey affected with this catastrophe at large?
Let me start with saying that Turkey is in a very sensitive geographical location concerning the earthquakes. The peninsula, Anatolian Peninsula, which Turkey is located, has many active fault lines, unfortunately. So we have, earthquakes almost quite regularly. I remember in my lifetime that several big, powerful earthquakes. The most prominent of them was in 1999, and more than 20,000 people were killed in that earthquake. And this one is like no other one so far. It's quite powerful and affected around 13 million people living in the south of Turkey, in the southeast of east of Turkey. There are many major cities which are just around the epicenter of earthquake. These cities are quite populated cities. Most of them have a population of 1 million or more. So 13.5 million people were directly affected by this earthquake, powerful earthquake. And there is unfortunately very widespread devastation in many major cities, at least 10 major cities in the east of Turkey. Devastation is so high that, many buildings were collapsed, and it happened in a very, early time in the morning when the people were out inside the buildings. So that's why the casualties are quite, high, alongside with many other reasons that these earthquakes, actually not a single earthquake, but more than one major earthquake. There were two earthquakes following each other around 9 hours. So the devastation is quite high.
There was also a dispute in the numbers that have been claimed. Now, according to some statements that I've read in the newspaper, there was not one earthquake, rather, there were more than one. So, is it the aftershocks that have hit Turkey, or was it two different events taking place on the same day?
Unfortunately, the second one was not an aftershock. It was a separate and isolated major earthquake, which was almost with the same power of the first one, 7.6, and the first one was 7.7, and the second separate earthquake that happened 9 hours later, afternoon of that day, and it was 7.6 Richter scale. So unfortunately, there were two separate major earthquakes, and both of them were classified one of the most powerful earthquakes that happened on Earth in the land. Because they happened in a very shallow underneath, so the devastation is quite high.
And Dr. Adil, which one of these two earthquakes that have hit Turkey so badly have caused more damage? Because my common sense says that the first earthquake might have weakened some structures that might have come down with the second earthquake. Tell us more about it, please.
As far as we know, the first one has already, devastated too many buildings, and the second one was almost the same amount of, devastation that caused by the second earthquake, because the buildings became quite fragile after the first shock, and the second earthquake really shaken the buildings even further. Maybe as far as the human lives casualties are concerned, the first one seems to be the most powerful one, but also the second one made a very major, damage to the buildings and to the human life, unfortunately.
Now, did it affect the entire country, or was the damage more focused in one particular part of country? And if so, which part of Turkey is mostly affected of this catastrophe?
Uh, Anatolian Peninsula is a very large land, and as I said in the first part of my speech, most of the Anatolian Peninsula are actually sensitive to the earthquakes because of the active fault lines in the west and in the east, in the north. Only the central Anatolia seems to be a bit free from active fault lines. In the past, in the recent decades, we had powerful earthquakes in the west of Turkey, like near Istanbul, especially the city called Kocaeli, which is on the coast of Marmara Sea. It's an internal sea in the west of Turkey, and there was another earthquake near that city, which is called Düzce in 1999 again. Most of the powerful earthquakes happened so far in the east, in the west, and in the east of Turkey. In recent decades, we had powerful earthquakes in the east of Turkey as well, eastern part of Turkey. But this time only the southeast cities were affected, because the epicenter of that two earthquakes, were inside the city called Kahramanmaraş, which is in the southeast of Turkey, and there are actually major cities around that city, like Adana. Adana is like a fourth or fifth major cities concerning the population in Turkey, and that city is again very close to the epicenter. Gaziantep and Hatay are also very populated, highly populated, densely populated cities. And also Gaziantep and Hatay, for example, many Syrian refugees, asylum seekers, or the irregular migrants, because of the war, millions of people came to these cities as well. So these cities are even more populated because of the migration from Syrian land. So that's why this eastern Anatolian part of Turkey are mostly and heavily damaged. I have to say that these earthquakes were so powerful that it was even felt, both of them were felt in far cities like Ankara. Ankara is at least 600 or 700 kilometers away from that region. So even in that city, we all felt the power of that earthquakes.
Dr. Ajal, I don't wish to get into hardcore economics with you, as I understand this might not be your area of immense expertise, but we are all aware of the fact that Turkey is running through a very rough patch of its economic history. And while Turkey is grappling with its economic crisis, a problem of this magnitude will have its own economic costs as well. How afraid are you toward the economic impact of this catastrophe?
As you say, as Turkey, we have been some economic difficulties in recent couple of years. Some of the economic problems were quite local problems, generated from the circumstances of Turkey, but also most of them actually, were generated because of the global elements, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war. Turkey is mostly dependent on the export of energy from outside, almost more than 90%. So the rising energy prices really affected badly the Turkish economy. Only recently, in recent months, a couple of months, the Turkish economy seems to be recovering from these heavy, burden of energy prices. And there has been recently quite optimistic statements about the future of the economy. But this earthquake came in a very bad time, just at this time that the economy is trying to recover. And also there will be an election in 3 months' time. So the earthquake happened in a very sensitive time, economically speaking and politically speaking. Earthquake happened in a very sensitive time. And we can estimate that Turkish economy would be damaged because of this earthquakes, or the devastations because of the earthquakes, But I have to say that this region is not in the center of Turkish economy. If we talk about the western part of Turkey, then it would be even much further damage to the economy if that kind of earthquakes happen in the west of Turkey. But I have to say that at least locally, concerning more than 10 million people, there would be a very difficult economic circumstances in the years coming. It seems like Turkish economy will be trying to recover this region in next 3 or 4 years at least, concerning the buildings and accommodation, and there will be serious problems, to remedy these kind of large scale of damage.
Dr. Yugel, the relationship between Turkey and the West has also been in a, in a negative trajectory, I must say, particularly the relationship with the United States and the EU members have not been very pleasant in the recent past over a number of issues. So how has been the response from your Western partners?
Yeah, that's quite right. Turkey has been having some political problems with Western countries, especially in some European Union countries like France, some northern countries of Europe like Sweden and Finland, recently especially Sweden, and Greece as well. And also, Turkey has been having some problems with United States, specifically in certain issues like in Syria, and concerning the weapon purchases from Russia before the Russia-Ukraine war. And there were already some, tensions issues between Turkey and United States and Turkey and European Union countries, at least most of the European Union countries. And the Russian attack on Ukraine came in that very focal point of the bad relations between Turkey and some other countries in the West. During the Russian-Ukraine conflict, Turkey was labeled as not really supporting the Western countries' attitudes against Russia, and also as well as the attitude of NATO. Actually, this is a bit misleading to say that Turkey is doing this purposefully without any reason. It's quite clear that Turkey was put under heavy pressure, especially by the United States, for some other reasons before the Russian-Ukraine war. When the Russian-Ukraine war started, and Turkey was not in a position to support the Western countries without any precondition. Although there were even some military sanctions applied against Turkey by United States before the Russian-Ukraine war, and Turkey was recently demanding to not to see such military, at least military and economic sanctions against Turkey as an ally member of NATO. But these kind of developments did not happen, so Turkey was left without any option but to try to keep its economically significant relations with Russia. So before the earthquake, the situation was so sensitive, especially with Greece. Turkey has many disputes in the Aegean Sea with Greece, and the United States has started to even further military cooperation with Greece, and this was received by Turkey as a potential threat to Turkish security. And the relations were so sensitive before the earthquake. But after the earthquake, it seems like these countries are taking a very mild approach to Turkey. Just after the earthquake, Greece, declared, although there was no official contact between Turkish and Greek officials, and the Greek foreign minister and then prime minister called Turkish president to offer their support. And now we have a rescue team from Greece, and we have rescue team from United States, and also many NATO countries declared that they are ready to help, and most of them have already sent rescue teams to Turkey. And European Union, there is a disaster unit inside the European Union. Turkey has been part of that, and at least 16 European countries have already sent rescue teams. I just believe that their support will continue in the days coming to remedy the casualties that caused by these earthquakes.
But from your answer, I just failed to understand whether you are happy with the response you got from the West, or you believe much better could have been done.
Yeah, at the moment, if we don't think about the existing and unresolved disputes, everybody seems to be quite satisfied with the support of these countries, especially for rescue efforts. That's all. But beyond that, we don't know whether these disputes are going to be settled inside this positive atmosphere that was created by support during the earthquake. We can easily say that there is a great satisfaction in Turkish community that Western countries, are so eager to support Turkey in rescue efforts and some other, related issues. But I can say that it's not clear at all at the moment that these major disputes are to be solved quite easily because of this positive atmosphere.
Dr. Ajal, I'm just imagining that for the government of Turkey, this certainly would be a crisis that they were not anticipating. So, how difficult is the response? How difficult is the situation in hand, and how is the response of the government? Because we can imagine that if it's a devastation on such a large scale, the government would also be constrained with its resources.
Turkey had a very devastating earthquake experience, especially in 1999. So that means like more than 20 years ago, not very long time actually. Turkey had a very bad experience, and that earthquake was quite devastating in at least two cities, and more than around 20,000 people were killed in that earthquake. So after the earthquake, many regulations have been changed to be a prepared country for such big earthquake disasters. Many new regulations for buildings and many other related, construction activities. And in recent years, everybody believed that Turkish rescue teams and many other organizations are quite well prepared for an earthquake of a scale of one that happened in 1999. But I think it seems now that such an earthquake, at least two earthquakes happened almost in the same day and caused such a big scale of devastation. Nobody actually dreamed of seeing such a incredibly huge amount of devastation, covering at least 10 major cities. And this earthquake is regarded as one of the most powerful earthquakes that happened in the land. And so the devastation is so widespread geographically and population-wise. As I said, it affects now more than 13 million people and at least 10 major cities, and let alone the smaller towns around these 10 big cities. So I think nobody has anticipated such a big scale of devastating earthquakes happening in a single day. So that's why the government seems to be not really ready for such a large scale. But I also believe that, as some commentators say, no country is capable of getting over these difficulties if such an earthquake or earthquakes happens and cause such a big scale of devastation. I heard some commentators from television channels saying that when the people see the scale of devastation in the area, they mostly say that no country in the world could get over this one alone. So that's why it seems to be like government is not well prepared, but it's partly true, not wholly true. Yes, that was a shortcomings, not because the government institutions are not so ready, but because the devastation is so widespread and so large. I think two elements played the role of not matching the demands at the first days, at least for the first 2 days. One of them was that the earthquakes are so large, cause so large devastation, so big devastation that no country could be able to handle the case so quickly. Then the second one is that, of course, there was no anticipation to have such a large scale of earthquake. So that's why the preparations were not at that scale.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ajal, for being guest in our show.
Thank you, Syed.
Ladies and gentlemen, the problems unfolded in Turkey and Syria have affected a lot of people. While 22,000 deaths have been reported, there are unfortunately many that are still under the rubbles. And there are going to be many more whose household, whose shelter have been deprived. They have been deprived of their household and their shelter as an aftermath of this devastation. Let's see how the government of Turkey and the government of Syria try to manage these crises. I'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.